are moments in life when, if you turn your back, everything will continue as if nothing ever happened. And then there are moments when all it takes is for you to stop, and an entire fate will veer in a different direction. That noon in Red Rock Junction began like any other day. The Arizona sun poured down on the main street, scorching every weathered wooden plank. The wind carried red dust past the storefronts, long accustomed to the harshness of this land, a place where people learn how to survive before they know how to be kind. Ethan Walker pushed open the door and stepped into the town's only grocery store. The bell hanging above the door rang out dryly, then faded into the stifling air. He intended only to buy some water, let his horse rest for a few minutes, and then leave, as he always did. Red Rock Junction was not a place to linger, and Ethan was no longer the kind of man who stopped for anyone. Then the slap rang out, without warning, without concealment. A sharp, decisive sound echoed through the narrow space of the store, strong enough to make time itself seem to freeze. The hand of a middle-aged man came down on the young woman's face with a terrifying casualness, as if it were nothing more than a daily habit. She staggered half a step, her head tilted to the side. A red mark appeared at the corner of her mouth. But she didn't cry. No sobbing, no pleas, no gesture of resistance. She straightened up slowly, squared her shoulders, lifted her chin just a little higher, as if reminding herself that no matter what happened, she had to remain standing. In that very moment, Ethan Walker stopped. He had seen violence before, far too much of it. He had heard gunshots, screams, and crying through nights longer than memory itself. But there was something about this girl's silence that made his chest tighten. It wasn't fear. It was dignity. A quiet, unyielding dignity forged over time, the kind that appears only in those who have endured too much, yet still refuse to be broken. Their eyes met for a brief moment, very brief, but long enough for Ethan to see what the entire town had chosen not to see. 3 years of endurance. 3 years of being treated as if she didn't exist. And a fragile hope that had not yet gone out. Ethan's hand clenched instinctively. His body reacted before his mind could intervene. For years he had taught himself a simple lesson. Don't interfere. Don't get involved. Don't believe you can change anything. But now, standing in that dust-filled store, Ethan Walker understood one thing. If he turned his back and walked out, that girl would still be standing there tomorrow, and the day after, and quite possibly for the rest of her life. And this time, the silence would not belong to her alone. It would belong to him. Ethan Walker did not step forward right away. He stood still, as if his feet had been nailed to the store's worn wooden floor. Not out of fear, but because of a habit that had settled deep into his bones. A habit of not getting involved in other people's business. For many years, Ethan had survived by that habit. He had once believed in the law. He had thought that if he acted fast enough, correctly enough, firmly enough, then evil could be stopped. But life taught him a different lesson, one so costly that he could never forget it. That year he left home on what seemed like an ordinary evening. An incident. A suspect who needed to be pursued. Ethan promised he would be back early. But when he returned, the house was nothing more than a charred wooden frame. The smell of smoke, the smell of ash, and a silence that was brutally unforgiving. His wife, his son, gone. There was no enemy to draw his gun on, no one to punish. Only one naked truth. He hadn't been there. From that night on, Ethan Walker stopped believing in grand ideals. He no longer spoke of justice, nor did he mention salvation. He worked, took assignments, completed them, and then left. No attachments, no hope. No one depends on him anymore. Because if no one depended on him, then he could never disappoint anyone again. That was why Red Rock Junction was just a stopover, a place to buy water, rest his horse, and continue an aimless journey. He had passed through hundreds of towns like it, places where evil existed not because it was too strong, but because people were too tired to fight it. And Ethan had grown used to looking the other way. But the image of the young woman standing upright after the slap clung to him. Not through tears, but through a silence that was haunting. A silence that reminded him of himself after the fire, when he stood amid the ashes and couldn't bring himself to say a single word. Some pain does not scream. It simply waits there to see who is brave enough to look it in the eye. Ethan told himself, "Not my problem." He had said those words hundreds of times in his life, and almost every time they had helped him survive. But this time, the words rang hollow. Because if he turned his back and walked away, he knew exactly what would happen. Not because he was guessing, but because he had once been the man who didn't make it back in time. The feeling rose within him, not loudly, not violently, but slowly, heavily, like a hand pressing against his chest. A reminder that he could continue living as he always had, or, for the first time in many years, choose to face his own pain. Ethan Walker took a deep breath. Perhaps he couldn't fix the past. Perhaps he couldn't save everyone. But if he chose to turn away again, this time he would know exactly what he had missed. Her name was Lena Redbird. In Red Rock Junction, that name was rarely spoken out loud. People were used to calling her by other names: the hired girl, the shop help, or worse, whispers laced with contempt. No one asked her name, and no one cared how long she had been there. 3 years. 3 years living in the cramped room above the store. 3 years of waking before sunrise and sleeping only when her body was completely spent. 3 years being held in place by meaningless numbers called debt. Debt for food, debt for lodging, even debt for things she had never broken herself. Every blow had a reason. Every bruise was justified. And every time she stayed silent, that reason became more legitimate in the eyes of those standing outside. Lena learned one thing very early. Crying doesn't make it stop. Begging only makes it worse. So she chose silence. Not the silence of surrender, but the silence of someone holding tightly to the last piece of herself, her dignity. She wore a green stone necklace, a soft green, worn smooth by time. It was the last gift her mother left her before illness took her away. When the days grew too long and the nights too heavy, Lena would often grasp that necklace, as if touching it could still connect her to another life, a life where she had been called by her name, where she had been seen as a human being. Inside the store, Lena moved so quietly she was almost invisible. She bent down to pick up each shard, each sharp piece of broken glass, carefully, as if every fragment could cut into her own fate. Her hands trembled slightly, but her movements were precise. Not because she was weak, but because she had learned that even the slightest mistake could be paid for in blood. The entire town saw this every day, and every day they turned away. Because Lena was indigenous, because she was poor, because speaking up demands something not everyone is willing to pay the price for: courage. What Ethan could not forget was not the bruises on her face. It was her eyes, not empty, not desperate, but deep, calm, like water that has endured too many storms to ripple anymore. They were the eyes of someone who had suffered long enough to understand that if there was a way out, it would not come from pity. It would come from a moment when someone was willing to stop and look the truth in the eye. And in that brief moment, amid the smell of red dust and shattered glass, Lena Redbird did not know that after 3 years of silence, she was approaching a turning point. Not because she cried for help, but because for the first time, someone heard that silence. Red Rock Junction was not a bad town. At least, that was what people told themselves every morning, so they could keep living as if everything were okay. There were hard-working men here, frugal women, and children running along the red dust road after school. There was a small church every Sunday, a noisy bar every night. On the surface, Red Rock Junction looked exactly like hundreds of other towns scattered across the West. But beneath that layer of red dust was a truth everyone knew, yet no one dared to name. They knew Lena was beaten. They knew she worked without pay. They knew she was being held there by debts that would never end. They knew all of it. Ethan realized this very quickly. He didn't need to ask many questions. All he had to do was look at the eyes of the people standing in the store that day. Eyes that avoided his, that dropped to the floor, that pretended to be busy with things that didn't exist. Not because they didn't care, but because they had grown accustomed to pretending not to see. Frank Holloway didn't need to threaten anyone every day. He only needed to exist. His money kept the town alive. His store gave people jobs. His connections kept everything running smoothly. And in return, people paid him with silence. Ethan had seen this kind of silence before. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was slow, persistent, and more frightening than any gunshot. Because when silence becomes a habit, evil no longer needs to hide. It walks openly in daylight, head held high, and calls itself order. An older woman in town whispered to Ethan when no one else was listening, "It's not our business." Another person spoke even more quietly, "At least he gives her a place to stay." Those words didn't come from cruelty. They came from fear disguised as reason. Because if they admitted that what was happening was wrong, they would have to face the following question. Why were they doing nothing about it? And that was a question most people didn't dare to answer. That evening, Ethan sat in the bar, listening to fragmented stories and strained laughter. Outside, the wind swept down the main street, carrying red dust that covered every footprint. He realized that Red Rock Junction didn't lack good people. It simply lacked people willing to do the right thing when doing so made them unsafe. Lena was still there. Tomorrow and the day after, she would still be standing behind the counter, lowering her head at the right moments, speaking just enough, and enduring in silence. Not because she was weak, but because the entire town had learned to let her survive on their behalf. And it was then that Ethan Walker understood something that weighed heavily on his heart. Frank Holloway's brutality was not the most dangerous thing in Red Rock Junction. The most hazardous thing was that people had accepted living alongside it. And if no one broke that circle of silence, then it wouldn't be only Lena who was trapped. The entire town would be too. The next morning, Red Rock Junction woke beneath the dim light of dawn. The sun rose behind the low hills, casting a pale yellow glow over the town, as if the land itself were hesitant to face the new day. Ethan Walker tightened his saddle and pulled the brim of his hat low over his eyes. He did not leave as planned. Not out of curiosity, but because there are some things that, once seen, can no longer be forgotten. The first clue came from an offhand remark in the bar the night before. A drunken man muttered about missing cattle, about strangers appearing behind Frank Holloway's store at midnight. To Ethan, it was no longer a rumor. It was professional instinct speaking. He rode along the dirt path leading behind the town, where towering red rocks blocked the view. There, among dry brush and abandoned corrals, Ethan saw footprints that didn't belong to Red Rock Junction. Fresh wheel tracks. Crates were hastily covered with old tarps, and faces that never appeared in daylight. The truth began to surface piece by piece. Frank Holloway was not just a brutal man venting his anger on a girl with nowhere to go. He was a link in a much dirtier chain, harboring criminals, smuggling livestock, and trading protection for money and silence. Red Rock Junction hadn't merely ignored violence. It had actively condoned it. It had lived off it. Ethan stood there for a long time, listening to the wind funnel through the rock crevices. He understood then what made his blood run cold. Lena was not an exception. She was a symbol of how far a human being could be exploited when an entire system chose to turn away. Meanwhile, in the small room above the store, Lena sat by the narrow window where the light barely reached the wooden floor. She washed her old wounds slowly, carefully, as she had done for 3 years. Each bruise carried a memory. Each scar was a reminder that she was still alive. She clutched the green stone necklace and whispered the prayers her mother had taught her, not to ask for someone to come and save her, but to ask for the strength not to lose herself, even as everything around her tried to drag her down. When Ethan returned to town, his steps felt heavier, not because of fear, but because he knew he had gone too far to turn back. The truth, once faced, demands a price, and Ethan understood all too well. If he chose to act, he wouldn't be confronting Frank Holloway alone. He would be confronting an entire order that had existed for far too long. But for the first time in many years, that thought did not make him want to run. Because there are moments when evil doesn't need to be defeated with guns. It needs to be exposed. And as the sun climbed higher, light spilling over the old wooden rooftops, Ethan Walker knew that Red Rock Junction was about to face the truth it had tried to bury for so long. That noon, Red Rock Junction was hotter than usual, not because of the sun, but because of an invisible tension hanging over the main street, as if the entire town could sense that something was about to happen, though no one dared to say it out loud. The door to Frank Holloway's store opened. The bell rang, short, sharp, final. Ethan Walker stepped inside, slowly, calmly, like a man who had thought long enough and no longer had anything left to hesitate over. There was nothing unusual about him, no show of force, no threats. Yet every step he took carried the kind of pressure only those who have faced life and death can bear. Lena was standing behind the counter. She was arranging simple goods, flour, canned beans, old bottles of oil. Her hands still trembled slightly, a habit that never truly disappeared. But her face was composed. 3 years had taught her how to hide fear, the way people learn to hide scars beneath long sleeves. When she saw Ethan, she paused for a single breath, not because of hope, but because of instinct. Frank Holloway turned around, the familiar smile spreading across his face, the smile of a man accustomed to never being challenged. But it faltered when he met Ethan's eyes. There was no hatred there, no impatience, only the cold clarity of someone who had seen enough to know exactly who he was facing. "Is there a problem?" Frank asked, his voice carefully casual. Ethan didn't look at him right away. He looked around the store, at the old wooden shelves, at the floor that had witnessed so many moments of silence. And finally, his gaze settled on Lena. Not the way a man looks at a woman who needs protecting, but the way one human being looks at another is equal. "I hear you keep people here with debt," Ethan said evenly, neither loud nor soft. I hear you call it work. Frank scoffed, a laugh well practiced at crushing difficult questions. Not your business. Right, Ethan replied. Until it is. The air in the store grew thick. People outside began to gather. They didn't come to intervene, they came to watch. Red Rock Junction could look the other way from injustice, but it never missed a confrontation. Frank stepped forward, his hand drifting close to his gun belt. She owes me, he said more loudly. And as long as she owes me, she stays. And then, something no one expected happened. Lena stepped out from behind the counter. Slowly, steadily. The room seemed to hold its breath. She stood in the middle of the store, her shoulders still thin, her face still marked by the traces of long days of endurance. But her eyes were different. No longer avoiding, no longer lowered. I don't owe you anything, she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but each word hit the wooden floor like a small stone, not noisy, but impossible to ignore. I was never your property. Frank stepped back half a pace, just a fraction of a moment, but to those watching, it was greater than any blow Lena had ever endured. Ethan said nothing more. He didn't need to. This time, the silence was no longer protecting evil. It was the pause that followed the truth being laid bare. 3 years of silence ended not with a gunshot, but with a human being standing upright and naming her own worth. And from that moment on, Red Rock Junction could no longer pretend it hadn't heard. Red Rock Junction fell silent in a different way as they left. It was no longer the familiar, complicit silence. It was the heavy silence of people who had just witnessed something that could not be taken back. Doors left half closed, curtains are shifting slightly, eyes watching from a distance, no greetings, no attempts to stop them, and no one daring to pass judgment. Lena walked out of the store with a small bag in her hand, just a few old clothes, a handful of personal items, and the green stone necklace around her neck, the only thing she carried with her from a life before. 3 years confined to a cramped room were now compressed into a few unsteady first steps on the red dust street. Ethan Walker walked beside her, keeping just enough distance. Not close enough to make her feel protected, not far enough for her to feel abandoned. He understood this better than anyone. Some people don't need to be pulled out of the darkness. They only need to know that someone is willing to walk alongside them. When they reached the horse tied outside the bar, Lena stopped. She looked back at the store one last time, not with anger, not with fear, but with a hollow feeling difficult to name, as if she were looking at a part of her life that had been taken from her, yet was finally allowed to close. You didn't have to do this, she said softly, her eyes still facing forward. It took Ethan a few seconds to reply. I know, he said, but there are some things, if you don't do them, you carry them with you for the rest of your life. Lena turned to look at him. This time, she met his gaze directly. No probing, no caution, just an honest look, given for the first time to a man who demanded nothing from her, no gratitude, no attachment, no promises. They set out as the sun leaned toward the west. The dirt road leading out of town stretched ahead, barren, yet open. Neither of them spoke. The steady rhythm of hooves blended with the wind. Each step seemed to peel away another layer of fear that had clung to Lena for years. She remained cautious, she knew that. Life had taught her that help sometimes came with a hidden price. But there was something different about Ethan. He didn't ask where she was going. He didn't speak of the future. He didn't promise that everything would be all right. He walked. As darkness fell, they stopped in an open patch of land where a few low trees broke the wind. Ethan built a fire, his movements practiced as if he had done this all his life, and perhaps he had. Lena sat across from him, holding her hands out to the warmth, the firelight reflecting on a face still faintly marked by bruises. In that flickering light, they both understood. They were not running away. They were leaving. And sometimes, leaving is not a weakness. It is the bravest act of those who have endured long enough to finally allow themselves to step towards something unknown, but chosen. They reached the edge of the reservation just as dawn touched the horizon. The new light was thin and gentle, washing the land in a pale gold, like a cautious greeting. Lena lightly pulled the reins and stopped. Before her lay a familiar path, a place that had once nurtured and sheltered her, and had also witnessed her quiet departure many years before. Ethan stopped with her. He didn't ask questions. He didn't urge her on. He understood that some doors can only be opened from within. A young man stood waiting near the stream. He looked at Ethan with guarded eyes, then turned to Lena. "Are you okay?" A simple question, but one that, for 3 years, no one in Red Rock Junction had ever asked her. Lena nodded. Just a very slight nod, but enough. That evening, she sat before the tribal council. Weathered, composed faces looked at her without judgment. No one asked what she had endured. No one demanded that she tell her story. Here, silence was not a shield for evil. It was respect. Ethan remained outside. He did not step in. He did not claim a right to be present. He understood that if there was one thing he was not permitted to do, it was to intrude on Lena's decision, no matter how noble the intention. When they met again by the stream the next morning, Lena slipped off her shoes and placed her feet in the cool water. The current flowed around her ankles, carrying a familiar sensation, the feeling of home. She didn't turn around when she spoke. "What do you think I should do?" she asked. It took Ethan a long moment to answer. "I think you should do what you haven't been allowed to do for the past 3 years." Lena looked at him. "What is that?" "Choose." The answer was simple, but Lena felt her heart tighten. Choose. A word that seemed ordinary, yet for her, it was the most incredible luxury. For 3 years, every choice had been taken from her: when to eat, where to sleep, when to remain silent. Now, with no one giving orders, that freedom itself frightened her. "I need time," she said slowly. "I need to remember who I am when fear is no longer controlling me." Ethan nodded. No disappointment, no insistence. "I understand." Lena took a deep breath. 1 year, she said. "No promises, no waiting. If something is real, it won't disappear just because time passes." Her words fell between them like a clear boundary. Not painful, but finally. Ethan held his breath for a moment. He wanted to say many things, but in the end he replied, "I will respect that." As he turned his horse and rode away, Lena watched until his figure grew small in the distance. She placed her hand on the green stone necklace at her throat. For the first time in many years, her heart was no longer beating from fear. It was a fight for the right to choose. Spring came to the reservation in its own quiet way. Not loud, not hurried, just green shoots slowly pushing up through dry soil, as if the land itself understood that healing always takes time. Lena Redbird spent a whole year there, among people who knew her name, who listened to her, and most importantly, who did not demand that she become anyone else. At first, everything was difficult. She woke in the middle of the night to familiar nightmares, invisible footsteps, doors opening, the instinct to stand straight even when no one was watching. But every morning, when sunlight touched the porch, Lena stepped outside, took a deep breath, and reminded herself that fear was no longer the one deciding the rhythm of her breath. She helped the older woman gather herbs along the hillside, Wrinkled hands showed her how to distinguish the scent of leaves, how to listen to the wind, how to let the body move in harmony with the land's rhythm. No one asked about Red Rock Junction. No one stared at her scars. Here the past was not erased. It was gently set down when the person carrying it was ready. Lena spent time with the children. She told them the stories her mother used to whisper each night, about courage that doesn't need shouting, about the strength of patience, about how a person is not measured by what they endure, but by what they refuse to lose. Each time she told those stories, she felt a part of herself being returned to its rightful place. On some mornings, she went to the riverbank at dawn. Cold water wrapped around her ankles, bringing clarity. She stood there for a long time, letting the current carry away memories she no longer needed. Not to forget, but to stop letting them lead her. Throughout that entire year, there was only one letter. No promises, no expectations, just a few simple lines written in steady ink. Ethan had bought a small piece of land near Tucson. If one day Lena wished to visit, the door would be open. She folded the letter and placed it beside her mother's greenstone necklace. She didn't open it again, but each month, when she sorted through her belongings, she touched it, not as a reminder of the past, but as a question still waiting for the right moment to be answered. What changed Lena was not the promise of a new life, but this simple truth. There was someone who had walked out of her life without taking anything of hers with him. No obligation, no debt, not even the fear of being held back. When winter passed, the sky turned blue again, and the spring wind carried its familiar warmth. Lena realized she had learned how to breathe without guarding herself. She was no longer living to escape. She was living to choose. And somewhere deep within, a decision began to take shape, not hurried, not forced, just quietly confident, the way spring always arrives, even when no one calls it by name. 1 year later, that morning arrived quietly. The wind moved across the hillside, carrying the scent of warm earth and young grass. Lena stood on the rise, looking down at the long road ahead. No one called her name. No one urged her forward. This decision did not come from fear, nor from gratitude. It came from a deeper place, where a person can only listen once they are still enough to hear themselves. She tied her bag again. It wasn't much. What truly matters has never required much space. The green stone necklace brushed lightly against her collarbone, no longer an anchor of pain, but a thread connecting what she had lived through with what she was about to step into. The journey was long, but light. Each mile seemed to return a piece of memory to her, no longer sharp. When dusk painted the small valley gold, Lena saw the house, modest, warm, unassuming. Thin smoke rose from the chimney like an unhurried greeting. Ethan stepped onto the porch when he heard the sound of hooves. He stood there, neither rushing forward nor hesitating, just close enough to say, "I am ready, if you are ready." In his eyes, the old sorrow was still there, but it no longer weighed him down. It had been set in its proper place, like a memory that deserved respect through silence. They spoke little. Words were unnecessary when respect had already spoken for them. Inside the house, there were things kept, a small wooden box and a few mementos. Lena saw them and did not ask. Some pain does not need explanation to be understood. That afternoon, they walked along the field behind the house. The wind carried the scent of sage and fresh soil. Ethan walked beside her, close enough to hear her breathing, far enough not to intrude. Lena stopped and turned to him. "I didn't come here because I owe you anything," she said calmly. "I came because I know how I want to live." Ethan nodded. No promises, no bonds. "Then we walk together," he said, "if that is what you choose." She placed her hand in his, slowly, firmly, not to be protected, but to walk beside him. As night fell, lanterns were lit, casting a warm glow. The house, the fields, the star-filled sky, all settled into a quiet peace without display. No one was running from the past. No one was afraid of the future. There were only two people mature enough to choose each other without losing themselves. Some stories do not end with miracles. They end with respect. And some lives do not need to be saved. They only need to be seen. If this story made you pause for a moment, keep that pause for yourself. Share it if you believe that freedom does not come from being saved, but from being respected. Leave a comment if you have ever stood before a difficult choice. And if you want to continue walking alongside healing stories, stay with Deep Life Tales. We tell stories, so no one has to remain silent.